In the mid-19th century, Europe was undergoing a profound upheaval. The Roman Catholic Church, which for centuries had held spiritual and cultural authority, was losing its grip in the wake of the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of secular nation-states. For the emerging ruling elites of finance, industry, and science, the Church's doctrines posed a barrier to the reorganization of society around capital and labor. It was within this context that Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, written in 1859, became more than a scientific treatise. It became a tool in a much larger cultural struggle. By proposing that human beings were the product of blind natural processes rather than divine creation, Darwinism undermined the Church's narrative of humanity's sacred origin and moral accountability. For industrial and political elites, secularism was not merely a philosophical stance, but a strategic necessity. If human beings were not divinely created, but instead accidental products of evolutionary struggle, then morality could be reframed in utilitarian terms: efficiency, productivity, and adaptation. This worldview dovetailed perfectly with the demands of industrial capitalism, where workers were treated as interchangeable units of labor rather than souls with eternal value. Critics argue that those who promoted Darwinism at the highest levels of academia, publishing, and political discourse may have recognized its scientific weaknesses. The mathematical improbability of complex life arising from random mutation, the conflicts with entropy, and the problems of irreducible complexity were not unknown. Yet the narrative of Darwinian struggle was too useful to abandon. It provided an intellectual framework that justified competition, hierarchy, and exploitation. If nature itself was a brutal contest for survival, then the exploitation of human labor could be portrayed as merely the continuation of natural law. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, soon extended these ideas into eugenics, which conveniently aligned with elite interests in managing population. From this perspective, Darwinism was less about truth than about governance. Competing factions of the ruling class, aristocracy, industrialists, financiers, and later political ideologues, saw in it a narrative that could secularize society, weaken the church, and justify new modes of managing human capital. The worker was no longer a bearer of divine image, but a biological organism subject to evolutionary forces. Progress meant adaptation to industrial life. Failure meant extinction. Of course, the ruling class has never been monolithic. Some factions sought to maintain religious authority as a stabilizing force, while others embraced materialist science as a tool of social engineering. Darwinism became a contested symbol in these struggles, condemned by traditionalists, championed by secular reformers, and manipulated by industrialists to frame social order as an extension of natural selection. Thus, Darwinism's rise was not a straightforward triumph of science over religion. Rather, it was the deployment of a useful, if flawed, theory by factions of power who needed to dismantle the Church's authority in order to reshape society for industrial modernity. Whether or not the theory was true was almost beside the point. What mattered was its utility in reprogramming culture and legitimizing the new social order. And while this narrative is largely speculative, it is grounded in scholarship and critical thinking. There are many logical inconsistencies in Darwinian theory, and critics would argue some aspects that are simply mathematically impossible. Random genetic mutations, followed by natural selection, cannot plausibly generate the vast functional complexity observed in living organisms. Combinatorial explosion. The number of possible DNA protein sequences is astronomically large, making the chance of stumbling upon sequences that yield functional, stable, and interdependent biological systems vanishingly small. Irreducible complexity. Certain biological systems, such as the bacterial flagellum or blood-clotting cascades, appear to require multiple interdependent parts working together, which critics claim could not have evolved gradually through intermediate non-functional stages. Probability thresholds. Some argue that the time available since life began on Earth is insufficient for random mutations and selection to explore enough sequence space to produce the observed biodiversity. But it isn't just the math of Darwinian theory that fails. The very argument itself runs counter to known and observed truths about the nature of reality. Entropy and disorder. The second law states that entropy, disorder, tends to increase in closed systems. Critics contend that Darwinism requires increasing biological order and complexity over time, which appears to contradict this trend. Information growth. Evolutionary processes supposedly require a net increase in genetic information, but entropy-driven processes would instead tend toward degradation or loss of structured information. Open system counterpoint. Evolutionary biologists counter that Earth is not a closed system. It receives energy from the sun. But critics respond that while energy flow can sustain complexity, it does not explain the origin of highly specific, functional information encoded in genomes. Nonlinear interdependence. Biological systems are networks of feedback loops, signaling cascades, and cooperative molecular machines. Critics claim such systems cannot evolve piecemeal because partial or incomplete networks would not function. Fine-tuning. Organisms rely on tightly coordinated parameters, such as enzyme efficiency, genetic regulatory networks. Small random changes are more likely to disrupt than improve these interdependencies. System-level constraints. Critics argue that selection acts on organisms as integrated wholes, not isolated mutations. Therefore, building new species by tinkering with random mutations is not feasible at the systems level. To sum up, Darwinian evolution is mathematically improbable due to the combinatorial explosion of genetic possibilities, and furthermore, it conflicts with the entropic tendency of physical systems. It struggles to account for the emergence of highly ordered, interdependent biological systems through gradual accumulation of random mutations. This is not about religion versus science. This is about a flawed and illogical theory that has become dogma for a scientific community that has lost the ability to think. If you like this video, please hit the subscribe button, and thank you for watching.